Joining me in the studio to discuss this now, TalkTV's political correspondent Alicia Fitzgerald, hi there, and former Labour official Richard Power Sayeed. And down the line is polling expert Professor John Curtice. Let's start with you, Alicia, to set the scene. So George Galloway has just given a press conference. What does he mean, a dangerous crossroads?
Well, so this was just after he was officially sworn in as a Member of Parliament, and he chose to make a little speech outside the Houses of Parliament and basically just reiterated his position on a number of issues. When he said a dangerous crossroads, I think there he was referring to the shift that we've seen from the Labour Party in recent years under Keir Starmer's leadership. We've seen that shift from a more leftward-leaning party under Jeremy Corbyn, more towards the centre with Keir Starmer. And I think also there what he's also referring to is the stance on the conflict in Gaza at the moment. And obviously we know that George Galloway is very much pro-Palestine, but also actually pro-Hamas as an organisation. And this is something that he really kind of fought that Rochdale by-election on. So I think what he was alluding to there was just the kind of divide that we're seeing in Parliament. And he was basically saying that he's going to stand up for those who feel disillusioned and disenfranchised by the Labour Party and those more left-wing voices.
Let's bring Richard into this. Obviously, we saw on Friday the Prime Minister give a speech and address the nation in a way that isn't common practice in this country, although we all became rather used to it during COVID, an unusual thing to have done. Did it seem to you that that was in a direct response to George Galloway being elected in Rochdale?
Well, I think it was taking advantage of that. I think it was exploiting it. You know, I think George Galloway is a pernicious and deeply unpleasant force within British politics. He has been for a long time. He exploits grievances, some of which are very legitimate, but he does it in a really hypocritical and nasty way, a way which I think is deeply wrong. And then
let me ask you what you mean by that. Why hypocritical and why particularly nasty? Just so people realise what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think most people watching this will be deeply disturbed by what's happening in Gaza right now. They'll be seeing pictures of children starving, and they will really want that to stop. They will want the Israeli Defence Force to stop doing that. But they will also want that to be balanced with the recognition of how terrible what happened on October the 7th was, the appalling evil that Hamas committed, and they don't see those things as being contradictory.
And they'll also know that at the moment it seems as if, I've been reading about this all day, and I'm sure you have too, that the possibility of a ceasefire is a valid and real possibility, yep. But it's dependent upon Hamas revealing where the hostages who were taken by terrorists on October the 7th are, who are still alive. Where are they? And returning them. And so it's a very real possibility, but it at the moment lies in the hands of Hamas to make it happen, doesn't it?
Another deeply exploitative thing and hypocritical thing that I think we should be really angry at somebody like George Galloway for is the way that he, on the one hand, is saying, oh, I'm pro-Palestine, I want to protect people in Gaza. But you know what? When people were experiencing very similar kinds of suffering and misery at the hands of Bashar al-Assad in Syria during the civil war there, he was on Assad's side.
And why was that? Well, how did he explain that?
I think he would justify it along the lines of Assad is the sort of anti-US hegemony side of that conflict, and the rebels were undermining him. I mean, I cannot stress how wrong an interpretation that is of what was happening in Syria at the time, but that's how he would justify it.
Let me have a comment from Alicia on that.
Well, I think that's true, and I think it's this idea of being kind of anti-establishment and being a freedom fighter, which is something that George Galloway has consistently supported throughout his political career. I mean, we'll remember back when he was a Labour MP, he came under fire for pretty much supporting Saddam Hussein. It's slightly in his words. He said that he was being really courageous in what he did there. So I think this is kind of a consistent pattern that we've seen. He's very anti-UK involvement in these conflicts, unless it's to try and reach peace. And he's also just quite anti-establishment and anti kind of these big capitalist movements, I'd say. That's probably how he'd characterise it.
I think that's how he'd characterise it, and perhaps the kind of the thing that is so unreal and such nonsense about his positions is that you can't be the anti-establishment person and also like punching down on the people of Syria who are trying to resist their violent authoritarian dictator. Like, Putin's not a radical anti-establishment person. Bashar al-Assad is not an anti-establishment person. These are the nastiest dictators, the most powerful people in the region.
And do you think George Galloway doesn't grasp that, he doesn't understand that, or do you think he does understand that and there's something quite cynical about the way in which he portrays himself as a freedom fighter but also is partisan on behalf of really terrifying dictators that he knows precisely what he's doing? Do you think he grasps it and does it deliberately or doesn't understand it?
I think he's an attention seeker. I think that's really kind of fundamental to how these kinds of people work. When you work in politics, I'm sure Alicia will be familiar with this kind of thing, you meet a lot of people who are just addicted to the attention. And somebody like Galloway gets it every few years. And I think he'll pretty much say whatever he needs to in order to get a bit more of it. You know, he's gone from being sort of supposedly left-wing to actually taking up an enormous number of right-wing talking points and socially conservative positions, such that Nick Griffin from the BNP now supports him. I mean, if that's not a sure reason to reject this guy, then I don't know what is.
Let me bring Professor Sir John Curtice in to the conversation. Thank you, Professor, for joining us this afternoon. When you're watching this unfolding, George Galloway being sworn in as a Member of Parliament in this country, what are your thoughts on what's going on and why? What do you see happening here?
Well, the thing that one has to appreciate is that however much one might dislike Mr. Galloway's politics and some of the stances he's taken, and we've just heard a lot about that, what one also needs to understand is that he's a remarkably effective campaigner. He's a highly charismatic figure, and of course he will be entering a House of Commons where for the most part charisma is not widely on display, including not least from any of our party leaders. And he's of course long since demonstrated in Bethnal Green, in Bradford, and now in Rochdale, that in particular, he's capable of articulating the concerns that some in the Muslim community have about the situation in the Middle East, particularly at the time of conflict, the Iraq War, where, you know, widely it's now accepted that the UK and the United States made a mistake in the second Iraq War. And now more recently, there is widespread public concern about the position in Palestine, a concern that's certainly particularly widespread amongst Muslims, but of course also not exclusively to Muslims. So these are the circumstances that have enabled him to repeat for the third time his ability to defeat Labour, of course helped by the fact that the Labour Party itself got snagged on the nail of the fact that Sir Keir Starmer, in his determination to demonstrate that his party is different, and in that he's certainly succeeded, that he's taken a very strong stance against anti-Semitism, and that did, in the end, help to bring down the Labour candidate. I think one of my observations on Rochdale, by the way, is I think one of the things we're going to have to watch in the general election is that as soon as nominations have closed, will we end up with a load of claims either that Conservative candidates are anti-Muslim or Labour candidates are anti-Semitic on the basis of recordings that were made some weeks or months ago of trawls through statements on Twitter, and then pressure being put on parties to disown candidates because of this. But I think we have to be aware that however much we may be concerned about anti-Semitism and prejudice more broadly, we have both our political parties have now set up themselves up for criteria of judgment that is capable of being used by those who perhaps don't think too kindly about either those parties or perhaps indeed our democracy more broadly.
That seems like an excellent point, Alicia, that this really could happen. You could have all sorts of candidates from all kinds of political persuasions being felled before the first hurdle on the basis of either anti-Semitic or Islamophobic comments that they've made or tweeted or posts that they've liked. I think the professor's absolutely spot on here. And if that happens, we've got complete disarray, particularly if you look at Rochdale as an example. So what do you think can be done to forestall that kind of thing happening?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think John made a series of actually really important and good points there. Too. And I think definitely the fact that we've seen such a heavy politicisation of religion recently. I mean, this has been obviously going on for a few years, but I think this conflict has really, really highlighted that divide. And we saw in Prime Minister's questions last week that really became the topic. It was these two leaders, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, both accusing each other of some form of racism or being against a certain religion. We had accusations of anti-Semitism towards the Labour Party, and then the Labour leader saying that the Conservative Party were Islamophobic. So that's definitely a real big political kind of hot potato at the moment, and something that I think lots of the public will be really annoyed about, because this impacts so many people. We have a huge Muslim population in the UK. We also have a huge Jewish population in the UK, and I think the last
we have a small Jewish population.
Small Jewish population in the UK, but I mean there are still
a quarter of a million million Jewish people and around about, what do we think, 3 to 5 million Muslim people?
Yeah, and obviously more
Yes.
Muslims than Jewish people, but
Yeah.
it's still a lot of people in terms of people who are impacted by this and who look at our political leaders and see these things being thrown around and probably feel really quite annoyed about that it shouldn't really be a time for political point scoring.
I think that last point is so important there, that actually over the last several years, when we've seen debates both about Islamophobia and about anti-Semitism, I think many Jews and Muslims in this country, I come from a mixed Muslim, Jewish, Christian family, so these things are things I care about quite a great deal, and I just think most people in those communities have looked at those political debates and they have not thought, oh, great, I'm glad that this issue that matters to me is being spoken about so much. They think, people are exploiting the danger that my community's in for their political gain, and people on both sides of politics have been doing that. Galloway is only the most extreme example of it.
Let me bring the professor back in. Discussion about polling. The Conservatives have hit their lowest polling score on record after a torrid start to the year for Rishi Sunak. The poll published by Ipsos on Monday suggests just 20% of the public would vote for the Tories at the next election, although traditionally people don't necessarily come clean if they're thinking of voting Tory, Professor.
Well, certainly the interesting thing about this poll, I mean, Ipsos is now our longest running opinion polling company in the UK. It goes all the way back to the late 60s. And therefore, it can compare its records going back. And the truth is 20% is a record Conservative low. Now, as always with these things, polls with exceptional results are always at risk of grabbing the headlines, and perhaps are at risk of distorting the overall picture. And indeed, this afternoon we've had another poll out that put the Conservatives at 27%, up 3 points. That said, and I think what one should do about opinion polls is to look at them across the piece. If you do actually take all of the polls for February from all of the companies, then by my calculations, the Conservatives slipped down to 24% on average, which is indeed slightly below where they were at in the immediate wake of the downfall of Liz Truss. And certainly more broadly, what we've really seen ever since the downfall of Liz Truss is the Conservative Party seemingly utterly unable to make any significant progress in turning around the substantial damage done to their reputation, not least their ability to perceived ability to run the economy that was done by Liz Truss's short administration. So yes, it's a headline, and perhaps it's a somewhat exaggerated headline, but there is a consistent message from the opinion polls, which is the Conservatives are continuing to fail to make significant progress. And of course, election day is getting ever nearer.